a questão do impacto emocional e saúde mental e como é que a gente vai lidar com toda essa questão neste momento. E ao professor Bruno, né, que entrou em contato com o professor para poder trazer um especialista na área para nos ajudar. Thank you, Professor Morgenstern, for being here with us and talk with us about this at this moment. Esse é o maior desastre, né, que a gente está vivendo, climático aqui no Rio Grande do Sul, e todos nós tivemos que passar por vários momentos aí, tanto do ponto de vista individual, né, pessoal, com a família, na instituição e na sociedade, né? Então, assim, num primeiro momento, todo o nosso esforço era para ficar seguro e suprir as necessidades básicas individuais, né? Aqueles que conseguiram imediatamente fazer isso puderam participar dentro da instituição para manter o hospital funcionando, e outros ainda a gente conseguiu ajudar, né, quem estava naquele momento desabrigado e precisando. Então, assim, todo esse primeiro momento, ele foi e tem sido para todos nós bastante desafiador, né, que a gente nunca tinha enfrentado uma situação dessa monta, né? E a gente está, né, imensamente envolvido. Então, aqui no hospital, por exemplo, a gente teve esse primeiro momento, o grande desafio foi a água, né? A gente não tinha água. Depois nós não temos suprimentos. Nós conseguimos enfrentar esse primeiro momento de falta de estrutura, né? Estamos agora todos aqui, já com o hospital funcionando, né? As pessoas que foram resgatadas, as pessoas foram atendidas, né? A Faculdade de Medicina, com apoio do Hospital de Clínicas, assumiu 4 abrigos do ponto de vista de assistência médica, e nós, da saúde mental, dando suporte para esses abrigos. Então, esse primeiro momento, ele foi super importante, e ele está agora entrando numa outra fase, que é a fase que a gente precisa pensar agora qual é o impacto disso tudo e como é que a gente vai lidar com esse outro momento. A gente tem uma reconstrução aí de casas, de escolas, de hospitais, de pontes, enfim, de toda uma estrutura física, mas a gente tem um impacto emocional aí em todo mundo que a gente também vai ter que lidar, também nesses 3 níveis, né? Do ponto de vista pessoal, porque mesmo quem não foi afetado diretamente, está impactado emocionalmente com tudo que está acontecendo. Do ponto de vista institucional, a gente tem muitas pessoas que sofreram diferentes níveis de impacto, e hoje a maior contingência do hospital, ele não é de infraestrutura física, ele é de recursos humanos, né, porque as pessoas foram atingidas, né, a gente tem um contingente grande aí de colaboradores e de alunos que tiveram um impacto realmente grande, né, nesse processo todo, e a gente vai ter que lidar com a instituição, e a gente vai ter que lidar com isso na sociedade também, porque todo esse impacto ele vai repercutir, né, do ponto de vista emocional em todo mundo. Então, a ideia é a gente poder pensar, né, também nesse momento como é que a gente reconstrói não só a parte física, mas a parte emocional de tudo isso que aconteceu, né, e o quanto a gente tem que poder não só pensar do ponto de vista assim, bom, vamos tratar as doenças psiquiátricas, mas como é que a gente vai prevenir que as coisas aconteçam? Como é que a gente vai lidar emocionalmente, né, com toda essa situação para que a gente evite um impacto maior, né, do ponto de vista emocional aí de tudo isso que está acontecendo? E o nosso maior desafio talvez seja reconstruir uma coisa que é o nosso hino extraoficial, né? Eu estava vendo esses dias e me emocionei muito ouvindo essa canção, que é a parte que diz: eu quero ver os campos floridos e as crianças sorrindo felizes a cantar, e mostrar para quem quiser ver um lugar para viver sem chorar. Eu acho que esse é o nosso maior desafio, é poder reconstruir esse Rio Grande, né, de novo, como um lugar, né, que dá para viver sem chorar. Então, eu quero agradecer novamente e passar para o Bruno para introduzir o nosso convidado e poder nos auxiliar nesse processo aí de pensar como é que nós vamos fazer as próximas etapas.
So, good morning again, Professor. We reached out a few days ago, returning from the American Psychiatry Association meeting in New York, we reached out to Professor Morgenstein, Dr. Josh, and he promptly replied, considering the situation we are all facing, this unprecedented flooding in our home state, and very kindly accepted to be here with us, sharing his lifetime experiences. He is the director of the Center of the Study of Traumatic Stress. He's also the chair of the American Psychiatry Association Committee on Psychiatry and Global Disaster. And he has this lifetime experiences providing support for different national and international organizations, how to deal with this kind of global disasters, and how can we, in mental health, provide support to people, communities. So it's an honor for us to have you here. Professor is a psychiatrist, also a family physician, and has this long-term trajectory with different organizations. So in terms of time, I send this gratitude from our home state to Professor and to start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me and to see the slides? Just want to confirm, are you able to hear me?
Yes, it's working. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm hearing my own voice, a little bit of an echo. Oh, I think it just went away. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And it really is good to be with you today to talk about this difficult issue and these unprecedented floods that are affecting your communities. It can actually be very difficult or feel very difficult to talk about a disaster when one is in the middle of dealing with a disaster. It's my hope that today, though not everything that I share with you may entirely be new to you, I hope that it accomplishes perhaps two things. One is to help put words to some of the experiences that people are having, and also to perhaps help provide you with additional thoughts and approaches to providing support for communities and planning for future events. So these are my thoughts and ideas, and I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest to report. Just to orient folks, our Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress is part of the Department of Psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the Uniformed Services University, which is our nation's federal medical school. And it was chartered in 1972 to train medical leaders in the military, public health, and others. The center studies trauma in the context of disasters, those that are considered natural or climate-related, as well as human-generated disasters. And over the past 37 years, the center's been involved in nearly every major disaster the United States has faced, as well as many international disasters. So we serve as our nation's principal organization to help bridge military and civilian communities through research, education, and consultation, as well as the dissemination of just-in-time action-oriented knowledge products to support disaster response and recovery, help people know what to do when a disaster happens. So in the brief time we have today, I'll talk about the psychological and behavioral effects of disasters on individuals and communities, both those that you may think about often, as well as some that we may not think about as often, but also aspects of risk and resilience during disaster events. We'll talk about a framework for delivering public mental health interventions, as well as some examples of practical actions to support and protect the health of communities. Disaster and preventive psychiatry is a synthesis of many areas of work, including trauma and emergency medicine, preventive medicine, global health, consultation liaison, and others. And it involves a shift to expand our focus more onto populations and wellness and prevention. And those are areas I'll highlight throughout this talk. Much of what we know about trauma actually comes from our study of disasters, including those that are natural or climate related, like floods, hurricanes and wildfires, as well as human-generated, like plane crashes or other accidents, acts of terrorism or war. Some disasters, of course, involve elements of both. So in the United States, Hurricane Katrina many years ago began with storms, but then ended with damage to levees that could have protected thousands of people from the prolonged effects of flooded homes and businesses. In Fukushima, Japan, an earthquake led to a tsunami which killed nearly 20,000 people, but also damaged nuclear reactors, leading to widespread community distress and displacement of 160,000 people. So in this way, disasters often aren't single events. Some disasters are fast-moving, and the extreme impact is short-lived, while others can be more protracted. And the time over which a disaster unfolds has important implications for how a community is impacted, as well as efforts needed to manage the event. Around the world, climate-related disasters appear to be occurring with greater frequency and are becoming more destructive. Looking at 15 years of satellite data in 119 countries, the World Resource Institute estimates that 580 million people around the world were exposed to extreme floods in 2010, and that by 2030, that number will grow to 758 million people. And this creates significant increase in the percentage of the world's population exposed to floods. And of course, it also represents a significant and growing concern for communities around the world, as well as those tasked with mitigating and responding to these disasters. And in Brazil, the United Nations reported that as of May 16th, these unprecedented floods have impacted over 2 million people and caused more than 500,000 people to be displaced. The collision of multiple disasters is increasingly common, and it creates unique risks and challenges. For instance, floods and other climate-related disasters occurred during the recent global pandemic, while the world experienced also economic crises and civil unrest. War and humanitarian crises right now and other global events also complicate the impact, the response, and recovery from climate-related and other disasters. As an example, here in the US, facilities that store hazardous chemicals appear to be exposed to increasing frequency and severity of climate disasters like floods and storm surge and wildfires. So in this way, a changing global climate creates risks not only for climate disasters, but possibly exposure to hazardous chemicals. So it's important that disaster responders, including our healthcare systems, use an all hazards approach to disaster preparedness that considers and addresses the full spectrum of risks, even beyond the current or most recent disaster event. Many disasters share common elements, such as the potential for widespread damage to infrastructure or physical harm, but they may differ in many ways, such as the impact that they have on society's trust in governments and other institutions, as well as the degree to which they bring communities together or serve to pull them apart. So knowing various dimensions of different disasters helps to better understand the impacts and challenges, resources, and needed interventions. It's useful to review the range of psychological and behavioral effects of disasters on individuals as well as communities. Historically, in nearly all disasters, whether it's a flood, an industrial accident, terrorism, or a pandemic, the psychological and behavioral impacts are the most far-reaching and long-lasting. It's important that we have resources to treat physical injuries from disasters. It's also essential to remember that more people are impacted over a much longer period of time by the psychological and behavioral effects of disasters, often creating a lengthy tail of mental health needs that may last for many years. When we think about mental health and disasters, we often think about disorders like PTSD. And in fact, PTSD and depression and other disorders are perhaps what's best known about disasters. These are important, and we have good treatments for disorders. But there are other outcomes of concern that we don't think about or talk about as often, that are much more common than disorders, and they cause significant public mental health burden. These include things like distress reactions, like insomnia or a decreased sense of safety, as well as risky health behaviors, like increased substance use in others. But whether or not someone has alcohol use disorder, for instance, the increased use of alcohol alone is associated with higher rates of work errors, presenteeism in the workplace, accidents, as well as problems such as family conflict and community violence. It's these early responses, long before disorders occur, that cause significant occupational and social problems, and they increase risk for negative long-term outcomes. It's also good to remember that the vast majority of people, including those who experience difficulties along the way, will ultimately be okay. Many people even experience an increased perception of their ability to manage future stressors. And this is important because finding ways to grow through adversity helps to build a sense of hope during a difficult time. We want to remember that children and adolescents may show their distress in same ways, but also in different ways than adults, and sometimes in ways that can be easily misinterpreted as misbehavior. Younger children may revert to earlier childhood behaviors or require more affection or closeness, while older children may withdraw or display aggression. Educating families and other caregivers on the different ways in which children and adolescents express distress, as well as important actions to help protect children, such as reestablishing of routines and parental and caregiver self-care. These can help adults respond more effectively and help children. Disasters can result in damage to infrastructure and spillage of hazardous or infectious materials. So after a flood, people may be concerned about water contamination from infectious diseases, dead animals, or even human remains. Many of these CBRN materials can be difficult to detect, and early exposure may result in symptoms that are nonspecific and difficult to identify, further exacerbating people's concerns and worries about them. Fear of exposure to CBRN materials can significantly complicate disaster response and recovery, because once people believe they've been exposed, it's very difficult to change this belief. So robust public health education that's tailored to different cultures and communities, including anticipating and countering misinformation, encourages health behaviors that are needed to effectively manage a disaster. The stress people experience in disasters occurs on a continuum, whether someone is a healthcare worker caring for flood victims, a soldier during war, a parent trying to keep their child safe during a pandemic. Protecting mental health, fostering resilience, and improving the ability to function are all heavily influenced not just by the individuals themselves, but also by support from peers and organizations and leaders. While some people will benefit from mental health care, like medications and psychotherapy, and these are important things to have, most people won't need these things, particularly early in a disaster. To reach the vast majority of those who have difficulties, it's important that healthcare and other organizations provide and facilitate a range of support across the entire stress continuum. This is also important because it's an opportunity to remind people that many of the experiences that they're having are normal and common, and that others have those as well. And this is an important piece of information, psychoeducation, we might call it, or anticipatory guidance, to help people know that these things occur and that they often get better over time, and where to go and what to do when they don't. And disasters aren't simply local events. Their impact is felt broadly throughout a society, well beyond the geographic boundaries of the event itself. Hurricane Katrina was one of the costliest U.S. disasters in history, which claimed nearly 2,000 lives. But it also displaced approximately 1.5 million people who lost their homes and neighborhoods, existing social, economic, and healthcare supports, and whose burden of community distress was transmitted throughout the country when they relocated. The psychological and behavioral effects of disasters unfold over time. During the honeymoon phase, people come together and they bond over a shared adversity. People may remain hopeful that things in their lives will be made whole again. And as time passes, resources often diminish and support for the disaster may wane as it fades from the media headlines. Health, financial, and work stressors mount for people, and the reality that things may never be normal again can lead to a sense of disillusionment. Anniversary reactions, things that remind people of the events and what has been changed and what has been lost, provide a critical opportunity for leaders to support community recovery through their words and their actions. In any disaster, it's helpful to anticipate these changes over time to most effectively use resources and plan interventions. Tipping points may occur in disasters and are often provoked by factors such as scarcity of resources, loss of trust, restriction of civil liberties, and things like conspiracy theories. When they occur, participation in recommended health behaviors needed to manage the disaster effectively may actually diminish rapidly throughout a society. It's important to remember that risk and resilience aren't innate characteristics, nor are they static, but influenced by time and context. We might think of stressors like toxin, such as lead or radon. To intervene effectively, we need to understand aspects of exposure, like who, when, what, the response over time, and things that buffer against it. Creating an organizational or community framework to help understand where risk is concentrated and how it's changing in the pre, during, and post-event time periods can be helpful for planning. The Haddon Matrix, which was developed as a risk management tool, can help an organization or other community to consider various aspects of a disaster across time. This tool is actually particularly helpful for doing something which is often very difficult during a disaster, and that's thinking beyond the present moment. In disasters, we think about risk as being the interaction of pre-event factors, event characteristics, and recovery variables, resulting in a cumulative exposure. For instance, the duration and severity of exposure to various traumatic aspects of a disaster are an important aspect of risk. Being displaced from one's home and social support system also creates risk. Within organizations, poor leadership and the inability of personnel to reset or recover is associated with negative mental health outcomes as well. Certain communities have consistently been identified as being at risk for adverse mental health effects during climate-related and other disasters, with some disasters creating greater risk for different groups. So special considerations in the preparedness, response, and recovery phases can be very helpful to preserve functioning and protect the health of these communities. For instance, socioeconomic status is one of the most consistent global predictors of risk for poor outcomes after disaster. Understanding the risks in any given community helps with disaster planning as well as response efforts. Like all disasters, floods are associated with a range of negative physical and mental health outcomes. Notably, one systematic review found that mortality rates increased by up to 50% in the year following a flood. Having one's home inundated with flooding or being displaced from a home and community is associated with increased risk for adverse effects across multiple studies, while things like social cohesion and stable housing have protective effects. These are important things to be aware of to help guide the allocation of resources in response and recovery. Displacement may result from floods, but also after many disasters, during war or civil strife, or from a region becoming uninhabitable. Being displaced from one's home creates a sense of uncertainty. It diminishes the protective effects of social connections, and it may result in loss of deeply cherished possessions. Being forcibly displaced, either from floods or other causes, is an independent risk factor for negative physical and mental health. And efforts to reestablish stable housing, recover possessions, rebuild social networks, and ensure access to health care can help buffer against these negative effects. Disaster responders, including healthcare workers, may be required to assist others while also being personally impacted by a disaster. Exposure to repeated disasters is becoming increasingly common. Our work with Florida Department of Health emergency workers revealed specific factors before, during, and after exposure to repeated disasters that were associated with various health outcomes. Difficulty recovering from and lower work productivity after the initial disasters were some of the risks for negative long-term outcomes. Understanding who is at risk for what and when enhances disaster planning, and it allows for the development of more efficient and targeted interventions that address the unique risks of any given population. Disaster responders, volunteers, and others may be exposed to human remains in the process of response and recovery efforts following floods and other disasters. Sometimes these exposures are anticipated, and other times they're unexpected and something for which individuals may not be prepared. Our center's work over the past 35 years has helped shed light on the range of negative mental health outcomes associated with exposure to human remains. One aspect of that has been establishing the concept of psychological identification, which is more likely to occur when people see human remains and think things like, that could be me, or that could have been my child. And this increases risk for adverse outcomes. Finding ways to prepare people in advance and to manage and limit their sensory exposure to remains can protect their health and functioning. It's also critical that people handling remains are trained to do so in a way that's culturally respectful, because the mishandling of remains can greatly increase distress for surviving family members and other community members. Efforts have certainly been made using and leveraging machine learning to predict risk for psychiatric disorder and other negative outcomes following a disaster. The broad spectrum of risk factors and the heterogeneity of many disaster events complicate efforts to more precisely identify individuals at risk. But things like artificial intelligence and crowdsourcing of data through wearables may offer additional opportunities to help better predict risk for a wide range of outcomes during and after disasters. Work during the COVID-19 pandemic revealed needs that were persistently expressed by healthcare workers to help reduce anxiety. While a flood is different than a pandemic in many ways, these are important messages and themes that may help guide efforts to protect healthcare workers in other disasters. If you look at this picture from Ukraine, you might see a vulnerable, frail, older adult grieving the loss of their home. Or you might see a defiant, resilient community member persevering through an extraordinary life adversity. In fact, both of these stories could be true. So it's good for us to be cautious about assuming who is at risk. Ongoing health surveillance is one important tool to help understand aspects of risk and protection in disasters and how these are changing over time. We also want to look for measures of resilience or even the good things that can emerge from bad situations. For instance, we could think about one segment of the healthcare workforce and other sectors of society that was more homebound during the pandemic. For some people, staying at home brought increased risk of using drugs and alcohol and other challenges like family conflict. But for others, it was an opportunity to be closer to family, develop stronger ties to their community, and find ways to enhance self-care. It's important to understand all sides to behavior that, for some, bring risk, and others that are protective and even result in growth. Being prepared for disasters can reduce distress and optimize response efforts for healthcare workers and other responders. The incident command system was developed after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The system provides an organizational framework for healthcare systems and others to ensure that required resources are available to them. And it also helps establish a chain of leadership and communication. Disaster management and preparedness really an ongoing process, including efforts to mitigate and better prepare for future events, in addition to response and recovery efforts. It's good to have resources in disasters. Our center has developed and disseminated disaster mental health education fact sheets for over 30 years in response to numerous disaster events around the world. They're brief and they're easy to read, and they explain often complex topics in a way that's easy to understand. The fact sheets provide actionable guidance to help address the critical question that all people have in disasters, which is, what do I do? And it provides guidance on actions to take as well as some to avoid to protect mental health and foster resilience. The fact sheets are tailored for various groups and communities impacted by disasters, including families, patients, first responders, and public health emergency workers, healthcare personnel, community leaders, and others. I've included a link to our repository that has over 100 fact sheets where you can search for content based on your role, topic area, or keyword. And these resources are all free to use, share, and adapt in whatever way supports the communities that you are caring for. Just as children may show their distress different than adults, they also benefit from different ways of hearing and receiving care. So talking about disasters, both before and during these events, can be difficult for parents and caregivers. Even finding the words to speak to children about these events can be difficult. How they affect people and what we can do to help. So it's good to have resources that are especially approachable to children. The Disaster Behavioral Health Curriculum Recommendations provides critical resources for rapid response during a disaster, as well as more detailed resources to help you learn about disasters and mental health, and even develop educational products or training materials. This document is the first of its kind, and it's the byproduct of a collaboration between the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress and the National Center for Disaster Medicine and Public Health. This document's also in the public domain, and it's free to use and share. In collaboration with the American Psychiatric Association, we developed a free online interactive training program in disaster and preventive psychiatry to better prepare people for disasters. It's the only program of its kind in the world that we're aware of. You can simply click on the Create Account at the page listed here, and you can quickly access the training at no charge. It's a good resource when you have the time, and it provides information on a wide range of topics, along with brief and actionable resources that are downloadable throughout the modules. In addition to mental health providers, emergency, primary care, and other healthcare personnel, as well as disaster planners and public health professionals, will find very helpful information to protect communities during disasters. Treating psychological disorders is an important part of caring for mental health after disasters, and it's an area with which most of us are familiar, or with which we are generally most familiar. So I'm not actually going to talk about that. In addition, the scope and magnitude of disasters, whether it's a flood, a hurricane, an earthquake, or a pandemic, requires community-level public mental health approaches that enhance wellness and preserve functioning by addressing early responses to trauma before psychological disorders occur. So we'll talk about a framework for public mental health interventions after disasters and specific actions to foster resilience and sustainment. You may be familiar with the concept of psychological first aid, which is generally used to describe an evidence-based framework for delivering scalable public mental health interventions to support resilience in individuals, communities, and organizations after disaster. It's important to note that around the world, the term psychological first aid is used to refer to very different programs and approaches in some cases. When I talk about psychological first aid, I'm referring to interventions that are specifically designed to reduce distress and improve functioning by enhancing the 5 essential elements of safety, calming, efficacy, social connectedness, and hope. For instance, feeling safe. In addition to being safe, which is also good, but feeling safe is an important predictor of a variety of adverse psychological and behavioral outcomes. Strong communities are protective during disasters. We've looked at community efficacy, which is characterized by a belief that one's neighbors will be there to support them during difficult times. It's a measure of community strength, and we examined collective efficacy in over 2,000 Florida Department of Health workers after the devastating 2004 Florida hurricane season. Reporting that one lived in a stronger community was associated with lower PTSD overall, but also diminished the role of injury as a risk factor for PTSD. So a better understanding of how to further strengthen communities is an important way that we can help protect health during disasters. When we think about interventions, it's good to consider the extent to which any given intervention may serve to foster one or more of the essential elements. I'll highlight a few practices that foster the 5 essential elements of psychological first aid to protect mental health and enhance resilience in floods and other disasters. These involve actions by individuals, peers, organizations, and leaders. One of the best ways to protect mental health in disasters will start with helping people meet basic needs. At some point, people may be better able to receive emotional support, but practically speaking, for many people, it's difficult to talk about feeling sad if your stomach is growling or you don't have a place to sleep at night. Acute stress response can happen to people after disasters, or they may observe acute stress response in others. Acute stress response can manifest as withdrawal or disconnection, or anger and agitation. A person may seem disoriented or not able to respond when you try to communicate with them. Acute stress response leaves someone unable to function or engage in behaviors to protect themselves and their loved ones. Our center developed this pocket card as a brief 4-step adaptation of a military intervention used for acute stress response, and this can be used by any community member. Helping someone calm an acute stress response aids that person in recovering the ability to function and protect the health and safety of those around them. It can also foster a sense of efficacy in the helper by reminding them of ways they can support others, even when a situation seems overwhelming. Helping people solve basic problems promotes well-being and improves functioning after a disaster. Helping people decide where to go and what to do brings a sense of calm and reminds people of their own abilities even when things seem overwhelming. Problem Management Plus was developed as a non-clinical intervention to help enhance functioning for people experiencing mental health problems. More recently, it's been found to be effective for individuals experiencing disaster-related distress and relies heavily on elements such as psychoeducation and social support. And it's also a program advocated by, endorsed by the World Health Organization. An important way to help people feel calmer and safer is to lower exposure to disaster-related media. Starting after the plane crashes of 9/11 through the COVID-19 pandemic, studies have revealed that disaster-related media impacts well-being. Increased consumption of disaster-related media is associated with feeling unsafe, increased alcohol and tobacco use, higher rates of post-traumatic stress and depression, and insomnia. Using public health education campaigns and role modeling from healthcare providers and community leaders can help encourage people to protect themselves by using media wisely and taking regular media breaks. For healthcare professionals and other leaders, the words we choose have power, and messaging during crisis has a profound impact on community well-being. Messages that are developed using established principles of risk and crisis communication, delivered by trusted and credible messengers, can help people feel calm and safe and encourage them to engage in health-promoting behaviors in a disaster. The proliferation of social media certainly facilitated the dissemination of misinformation and disinformation. So effective disaster response also involves delivering rapid, effective, culturally competent health education messages while promptly countering erroneous online information. Asking for help can be difficult, particularly for organizations with workers whose job is devoted to the care and safety of others, such as healthcare workers and others. Buddy systems are a more formal rather than ad hoc form of peer support, which is particularly helpful in organizations where workers do have difficulty asking for help. Buddies check in with each other, provide support and camaraderie, and they encourage self-care. Having a peer buddy reminds us there's someone that we can help who's also looking out for us, and that's very protective during disasters. Brief routine meetings after shifts or significant events where team members talk about what happened and learn together can enhance communication, cohesion, and safety, and also improve performance and morale. Particularly during disasters and other high-stress events, these activities also offer the opportunity to correct distorted thoughts where people might blame themselves for negative and unwanted outcomes. Correcting these thoughts early can be helpful in reducing the likelihood of developing stress reactions or moral injury. These daily informal check-ins also help team leaders and buddies identify any early, sometimes subtle changes of distress in team members, which allows them to reach out and offer help early before things get worse. It's easy to think of leaving the front lines of flood relief efforts, COVID-19, war, any disaster as a good thing. But reintegration, which is the process of coming back to normal daily life after prolonged exposure to extremes of stress, can actually be very disruptive. Reintegration requires people to dial down a mindset of being in the hot zone as they return to more day-to-day activities. Sometimes people feel a loss of meaning or a sense that others don't understand what they experience. They may even feel isolated or resentful toward friends and family. So leaders can reduce distress and improve functioning and enhance recovery time for the workforce by educating workers and families about how to support one another and making help available when it's needed. During the chaos and busyness of a disaster, it can help to have a basic set of principles to know if someone's doing okay. For instance, we might think that someone's having a serious problem because they have emotional outbursts, but strong expressions of emotion are normal during extreme stress events. A more helpful question might be whether a person can manage or control these emotions, whether those intense emotions are intermittent or becoming the norm. Similarly, it's normal to feel sad and disconnected sometimes. A person might need more time off on their own, and this might lead us to think there's something really wrong for them. But if they're still able to feel things and maintain a sense of connection to others, they're probably doing okay for now. These 4 basic questions can help guide your approach to identifying those who need additional contact and support. What leaders do and say during all disasters plays a critical role in the well-being of individuals that they lead, as well as the trajectory of community recovery. Leaders exist at many levels. In a healthcare system, this might include team leaders, charge nurses, medical directors, and other people. Leaders have very difficult tasks during a crisis or a disaster event. They need to find ways to influence people to take protective actions within complex and chaotic environments. They also need to hold a vision of where people need to go, the community and others, even when all those around them may be losing their ability to see beyond the present moment. And leaders need to engage in and help others engage in behaviors that ultimately foster community recovery. One of the most important tools for implementing leadership behaviors during disasters is being with people. Leadership by walking around is an essential aspect of leading during crisis. Being physically present with people allows leaders to understand what's happening for individuals and the community. Going to where people work and being shoulder to shoulder with them communicates a sense of respect and value, and it helps people feel that leaders appreciate their challenges and concerns firsthand. Being with people also allows leaders to communicate not only through words, but also by role modeling behaviors that protect mental health and foster resilience. Leadership through walking around is critical to facilitate a range of crisis leadership behaviors. Believing that one's actions have purpose, particularly during times of high stress and great sacrifice, can protect mental health. We worked with the U.S. National Guard during COVID-19 operations and found that service members whose leaders reminded them of the purpose of their work reported better physical and mental health, used less alcohol, and indicated a stronger sense of cohesion, all of which improve well-being and performance. Leaders can remember that simply reminding people of their purpose and the value of their work are things that help people to protect their health during disasters. During disasters, workers often experience a wide range of emotions. Unregulated emotions can lead to distress, poor decision-making, and impaired functioning, and even become contagious, negatively impacting communication and cohesion and morale. Leaders can help people to regulate emotions and focus them effectively, so they're adaptive rather than problematic. Leaders can help by providing education and training to their personnel, as well as by role modeling how to manage emotions. It's also important for leaders not to turn away when people express strong emotions. Leaders might even share that they have similar feelings by saying something like, "I feel angry as well," if that's true for them, which helps normalize other people's feelings. At times, leaders will need to remind workers to compartmentalize feelings to keep people safe and functioning by saying something like, "It's okay to feel this way, but right now we need to put that aside and focus on the task at hand. We will attend to those feelings later." Of course, it's important that leaders do return to and help address the feelings people had once safety and operational requirements allow for it. Leaders play an important role in creating a culture where it's okay to ask for help by role modeling help seeking and removing organizational barriers that create stigma for those who seek help. Leaders can also remember that it's often people other than themselves who ultimately help someone get to care. For instance, when organizations value getting help, peers can be an important source of support for someone who's having difficulties and help that person get to care when needed. Family members, particularly a spouse or significant other, often play a critical role in encouraging care-seeking behaviors. So knowing your workers and their families and who is an important influence on that person allows leaders to facilitate support. And grief is a near universal aspect of disasters and one that's often overlooked. After disasters, people feel a loss of their home and cherished possessions, community connections, disrupted life routines, and even a sense of safety. They may be grieving the death of family or coworkers or other friends. Grief and loss are important aspects of how a community experiences and recovers from a disaster. The term grief leadership was coined by Dr. Colonel Larry Ingram from the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research following the U.S. military air disaster in Gander, Newfoundland in 1985 that killed all 248 soldiers as well as the crew on board. This was the deadliest peacetime military air disaster in history. Communities in which grief leadership was utilized recovered more quickly. Effective grief leadership fosters healing and recovery through genuine and ongoing communication, by openly acknowledging and addressing issues of grief, facilitating processes that honor losses and help to make meaning of the event, and ultimately finding ways to look hopefully to the future. In healthcare systems and other communities, sustaining a sense of hope while acknowledging and addressing the challenges of the day can be a very difficult task during a disaster. Hope certainly isn't about being Pollyanna, and it's not about pretending that problems don't exist. Rear Admiral James Stockdale, he was a U.S. Navy fighter pilot during the Vietnam War, and he spent 7.5 years in a prisoner of war camp known as the Hanoi Hilton after his plane was shot down during a mission. And in a book written about Rear Admiral Stockdale, he described the tension between the ideas of sustaining a sense of hope while acknowledging and addressing the difficult realities in front of us. And in truth, both are critical in our ability to persevere during a prolonged crisis, to sustain a vision of a better tomorrow, and perhaps to emerge even stronger after the event. And I'll close with this, because sometimes when stress is high and we feel overwhelmed, it can be helpful to have a simple approach to caring for ourselves. So I'll offer you this one, PMVC. P is for phone, put it down. M is for media, turn it off. V is for vision. Most of us spend a lot of time looking at things right in front of us, and this can actually narrow our thinking and make it difficult to see beyond the present moment. Look out the window, find something off in the distance that feels calming to look at for a few moments. This can expand your problem-solving approach. And C is for connect. Reach out and connect with someone, preferably someone you haven't connected with in a while, and maybe even someone you think could really use a connection right now. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Professor Morgenstern, for this outstanding presentation. I'm sure this kind of information will be very helpful to deal with difficult times to come. We will now have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. And I will start the debate asking Professor Eugênio Grevet to make the first question, and then I will open to the audience.
Well, good morning, everybody. First, I would like to thank you, Professor Morgenstern, for being with us today. Hearing you about your experience in disasters is crucial for us because we have to organize our response to this flood that is just beginning. Yesterday, while thinking about what to ask you, I have so many questions to do for you. I was remembering our actions in the beginning of this situation, but a song from Led Zeppelin crossed my mind, When the Levee Breaks. And I realized that the song is a warning, saying, when the flow is imminent, do not hesitate, be prepared, and act quickly. Run, think, don't act emotionally. So it's interesting that the song is not from Led Zeppelin itself, but is a classic blues composed in 1929 after a big, huge flood in Mississippi. So it's a kind of outlet saying, this is what to do. Don't pray, run. So this kind of things is so important to have the ways to get out of this situation. I think is the most important things that we have to do and have. So shifting to our situations, for example, we lived in Porto Alegre all our lives here discussing if our dams or levees were useful because we don't have this kind of floods for at least 82 years. So this time is a time for 4 generations to forget about what a disaster like this means or happens with us. Going to the question, sorry, it's just an introduction. How can we be prepared for events or disasters like this that may never occur in our lifetimes?
Sure. Well, one comment, I would comment on a comment that you made, which I think is an important one about taking action to begin with, and act quickly. One of the things that's particularly difficult for us as healthcare workers is to act with insufficient information. We deal with precision. We want to get it just right. We want to make the right diagnosis. We want, and often for us in a disaster, not only is information incomplete, but it's constantly changing. And so particularly for those of us who are, say, perfectionists or who tend to work in a way that relies heavily on having almost all the facts in front of us, it can be very difficult to do that thing that you said, which is to act, to take action based on the best information that you have at the time. So that's an important thing for all of us in the healthcare profession to be alert to. The idea of all hazard planning, which I mentioned very briefly, involves the notion that one is ready for and thinking about many different types of risks, problems, disasters that can happen, whether that is accidents, whether that is floods, whether that is an act of mass violence. So the all hazard planning type of approach creates contingencies, creates structures and systems. It involves having drills and people being given resources and preparation and planning to address a whole range of different types of hazards. And it is certainly very easy and common to overlook experiences which we feel we haven't had or we feel are unlikely to have. There's a concept you all may be familiar with, a book that was written about the 5th risk. The 5th risk is the thing that you haven't thought about, or something that is so dire and unpleasant that you don't want to think about it. So sometimes using some of these structured approaches to considering a range of different hazards helps us to consider and think about the 5th risk, those things we've overlooked or that we don't want to think about.
Thank you. Another question from the audience? I will receive from the YouTube audience as well the questions here. While people is thinking about the questions, I have a question. I was thinking about how you emphasized psychoeducation, right? And also how we should avoid media, because I can tell, I saw some videos from the disaster that were very touching. And the same, I was thinking, I would like to hear your thoughts about if it's worth trying to use the media for psychoeducation, given we have 500,000 people affected by the disaster. So we will need something that could reach more people in order to get all assisted. But at the same time, we have this problem with the misinformation and this kind of thing, but it could be something to make the information and psychoeducation reach a larger number of people. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, effective use of social media for people who are skilled at using it can be a very useful resource to get information out to people. Basic information about understanding what is a normal response, where to go, how to know if one needs help. For instance, if you find yourself smoking more, drinking more, using prescription medications more, it might be time to talk to your family provider. It's normal to not sleep well for a few days or sometimes a few weeks after a disaster. If that continues or you find that you're not able to function, perhaps you go and seek help. encouraging people to talk to friends and other trusted members of their community. So using media or social media in particular, I think people gravitate toward to get that information out, I think is very wise and can be very useful. Part of the message might be to remind people to take breaks from the media and to limit how much disaster-related media they look at. So learning about how to protect yourself and your family can be very valuable in social media. But if one is finding that they're spending a lot of time looking at distressing images of disasters or negative messages that people are venting frustrations and anger that's simply making them feel more distressed or have more difficulties or feeling more socially isolated, then those may be signs that it's time to take a media break. So I think absolutely that social media can be a very helpful tool, and that part of the education one might provide is how to use media wisely.
We have a question from the YouTube talking about social media. We have an audience looking at this talk from YouTube, and they send a great question here. Is in the first week, we had a huge number of volunteers. That has been a curious thing about this thing. We have lots of volunteers, but sometimes it's not necessarily good if they are not organized. So the question is, these volunteers are trying to help. How should we handle and organize it?
Well, in the United States, for instance, increasingly over the past few decades, it has become much more difficult for people to just show up at a disaster and begin doing things. Because the structure and the command system that I briefly highlighted there. One of the things that can be challenging is, of course, that well-intended individuals who are coming because they want to be helpful, but they may not actually understand the risks and the hazards. Volunteers who are not part of organized systems can unfortunately sometimes become casualties themselves in a disaster environment. And so it's very important to be aware of the role and the presence of people who are volunteering. The other difference for volunteers is that they often are not prepared. This isn't always the case, but they may not have the same preparation and training that trained disaster responders do, for instance. So they may see and be exposed to things for which they are not prepared, and this can result in again, them becoming a psychological casualty of a disaster event. So finding ways to allow and encourage people to help within the community, but to do so in a safe and structured manner that does not work at odds with the formal response that the government or the local and regional disaster response systems are using is important. Incorporating volunteers into those systems. The Red Cross, for instance, is an organization that relies on volunteers, but they have a very structured system and approach to the way that they do that. In the US, we have other organizations that rely on volunteer individuals whose role happens during the time of the disasters happens, and otherwise they're sort of doing a job unrelated to disasters most of the time. So again, wonderful to have people as volunteers, because in part, volunteering and helping after a disaster may be part of how individuals themselves recover from this process. It gives people a sense of meaning, and it's a way of channeling difficult emotions into something that is helpful. So encouraging and supporting volunteer activities is a very helpful thing for the community, but doing so in a way that protects them and preserves the structure and integrity of the response system overall is also a wise thing to do.
Thank you. We are unfortunately running out of time. We have to finish at time. So I want to thank you, Professor, for taking your time and sharing with us your expertise. It would be very valuable for us. I want to thank you, o Hospital de Clínicas de Porto Alegre, a Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, for supporting this event and promoting it. And finally, thank you very much for the audience to be prepared to deal with mental health. Thank you.
Good to be with you.